Good morning. We're going to talk about the state of downtown parking. I'm Pete Messmer, Director of Parking for the City of Ithaca. The topics we're going to cover include the mission of the Parking Division for the City of Ithaca, our existing situation with the parking in the city, the approach of various strategies that we're looking at to address the needs, especially with the growth going on. So first of all, with our parking mission, this is our mission statement, to manage the city parking assets to provide high quality, comprehensive parking services that meet the varied needs of the public in a cost-effective manner. So I'll speak a little bit about what that is. First of all, with respect to quality and some of the initiatives we've done so far, recent improvements, we've got new equipment in the garages at the exit and entrance gates, the pay stations, all of that has been updated recently over last fall and early this winter. We also have live video assistance at each of the exits and the pay stations where you can push a help button and an attendant will appear on the video and answer questions and direct customers through transactions. Also in the city, it's been out there a couple years now, but there is now a Park Mobile payment app that users can access online with a cell phone and pay by this app instead of using cash or coin. And we also have remote payment options for validation of tickets, which I'll speak about a little bit later, that are good for especially businesses and organizations that may want to validate parking for guest speakers, customers, clients, and that sort of thing. And in our booths, even with our new park equipment, we're trying to keep staff in the booths during the peak hours in the garages to help customers. And upcoming improvements, the Green Street Garage is being looked at for replacement right now. It's under a planning and design phase, so that's ongoing. And we're looking at a comprehensive signage project for all three garages. We want to create a branding and common colors and themes to get the signage more uniform. One of our major goals, obviously, is to meet the varied parking needs of the public. There's a number of those needs: city residents, of course, workforce commuters, patrons and clients of shops, services, and businesses, tourists and visitors, the taxpayer, of course, residents of downtown apartments. All of those people have to be accommodated by the parking system overall in the city. We also would like to see cost-effective parking. We want to balance our supply and demand of parking space in the city to match what the demand is by the various users that I just mentioned. We would like to strive for a balance between cost and revenue as much as is possible, and minimize or eliminate subsidy. On the revenue side, we would like to look at that from the perspective of the value of parking, which varies by interest and demand of parkers in different places. So it's kind of a demand-based issue. Costs, we have the construction costs and the ownership and maintenance costs of the garages, for example. The maintenance in the garages varies from routine maintenance to major rehabilitations where we have to do major repairs. Routine maintenance would be keeping the signage and the paint markings in place, dealing with deck repairs and that sort of thing. Major rehabilitations are more involved and may involve structural repairs or things like that. And then there's obviously the cost of operations to keep our equipment running, keep our staff out there in the garages. And it's a balancing act between revenue and costs of all those things I just mentioned. And the parking revenues are various and come in various ways. We have different people using it, the tourists and the visitors, the downtown residents, residential parking permits out in the, especially in College Town where we have RPP zones. We have parking enforcement to keep the system functioning the way it's intended. There's workforce commuters buying permits in the garages. And of course we have all of the downtown patrons and clients of the shop services and businesses using the garages and on-street parking around the downtown core. We have special events parking. And we do have several flat lots in the city that are by permit. So right now parking revenues are not enough to offset all of the costs, so there is a subsidy for the parking system as a whole. And we also are well aware that the taxpayers of the city are also a stakeholder in this, and the subsidy is part of is paid for by the tax base, of course. The downtown garages right now are near or at peak capacity. These charts will show kind of where we're at. This first one shows Seneca Street and Green Street. Both of these garages have a certain amount of spaces on contract with the downtown hotels, the Marriott and the Hilton Garden Inn. There are some of the spaces in these garages that are for staff or are out of service right now. And then there's the public spaces that are available. In Seneca Street it's 331, in Green Street it's 250. A good operating peak occupancy in a garage is 85%. You like to leave 15% available for people coming in looking for spaces and so on. So Seneca Street runs around 78%, which is a little shy of the 85%, so there's some capacity there, maybe 20 or 25 spaces. The Green Street garage has a peak occupancy that runs around 87%, which is actually a little high compared to the 85%. So we really don't have any extra capacity in that garage. The city is partially operating, well, the city is a partner in the ownership of the Cuga Street garage, but it's operated by a private entity. The total spaces in there are 685. And the peak occupancy runs about 70% in there, so we have about 15% excess capacity, which is about 100 spaces in that garage. On street, these charts show kind of the situation. The size of the dot is proportional to the occupancy rate. So the larger the dot, the more highly used is the parking spaces in that block. So you can see from looking at these diagrams that there's a lot of high occupancy parking in the periphery around the downtown core, which is indicated on this chart in the yellow color. And a lot of that we think is workforce parkers and other people coming to the downtown are parking where it's free parking and they can walk into the downtown core. So that's kind of what you see in that diagram. And this diagram is just the opposite. The larger the dot, the green dots, the more availability of parking on that block. So large dots means where the open spaces are. So again, you see the smaller dots right around the blue or purple streets, which are the downtown core, where parking is not very available. And as you get further out around the city to the north and the west and the southwest, there's a lot of parking available out there where it's not paid parking. Also notice up in College Town, there's pretty heavily used parking in the areas right around the central area of College Town, College Ave, Dryden Road, again where the purple streets are. So that kind of shows you the situation on the streets. Community where there's a certain number of blocks, you can see there with the larger green circles just inside the ring. These are spaces that aren't being used much and could be used more. So we want to really look at those and how we can encourage the availability and use of those spaces. Garage repairs and reconstruction. As I mentioned, the green garage is currently under a planning and scoping and design process for its replacement. This process will take another 1 to 1.5 years, and then after that, the actual construction. So the design is going on now and anticipated into 2020. Hopefully beginning reconstruction in 2021. Seneca Garage has a remaining life of perhaps 5 to 12 years. We just completed a 3-year inspection and are finalizing the report for that to identify areas in there that need attention. As far as new anticipated parking demand because of downtown growth, we anticipate with the Herald Square project the need for 150 additional spaces. For City Center, probably around 90 additional spaces. For 202 The Commons, 50 to 100 spaces there. The Green Street redevelopment itself for that garage is going to include housing, apartments, so we're anticipating 80 additional spaces there. The Canopy Hotel, Canopy Hilton Hotel, just recently completed and soon to open. We anticipate 60 spaces that they'll need. So total projected demand in the downtown core is somewhere around 450 to 500 spaces compared to our excess capacity in the downtown garages, which is only around 120-25 spaces. So we have a shortfall, at least right now in the downtown core, of 325 to 375 spaces. Okay, how are we going to address these needs? So I want to speak a little bit about what we're doing to look forward and address this situation, especially in the downtown core. First of all, we recognize that we have to provide for various types of parking needs. The daily use residential parkers, the transient downtown parkers accessing businesses and services, visitors and tourists, especially with Cornell and Ithaca College, we have a lot of visitors and tourists in and out of the city, as well as tourist buses. And there's a need for long-term storage for residential parking. That would be for cars that people don't use too often that are going to be in the downtown apartments. And then of course the commuting workforce. So our current efforts, we're looking at a pilot park and ride as a joint pilot project by the city, TCAT, and DIA. TCAT Downtown Circulator is under consideration. That would be a bus route that would circulate the downtown core and over towards the Route 13 corridor and be able to circulate repetitively. We're looking at off-street opportunities for private flat lots or spaces on a small scale that property owners may have and be willing to rent. The DIA is working on a transportation demand management plan, a TDM plan, which will help to identify options for the workforce for using other modes of transport that would relieve the need to park some of their cars in the downtown garages. And as I mentioned with the example of that ring that I showed with the maps with the occupancy rate dot patterns on them, consideration of zones with longer hourly limits right in that kind of ring around the downtown core. It's another idea we're looking at. And as I pointed out, the excess capacity in the garages provides 120 to 25 spaces that will help. Strategies for managing the parking and generating additional capacity. First of all, when garages are looked at for reconstruction, such as the Green Street Garage, there's an opportunity to add some spaces. That's being looked at. The park and ride lots, we're doing the one pilot project I mentioned, and hopefully that will generate interest and information to develop that idea with more park and ride lots to fit together with the transportation demand management project between the city and DIA to help relieve congestion in the downtown garages by promoting other modes of transit. There is a possibility of private parking garage, a private parking garage project. That's not well developed yet in terms of what the possibilities are there, but it is a possibility. And then private and municipal efforts to develop flat lot parking is being looked at. And finally, as I mentioned, the transportation demand management effort. The driveway and private space rental apps, there's a few of those out there. We're evaluating them, and that would be similar to the idea of the Park Mobile app that we use for on-street parking. It would be an app that would be available to anyone on a cell phone, and private property owners, whether they have a small parking lot or maybe even just a large driveway and are willing to rent private spaces, kind of like Airbnb, for example. That's another idea we're looking at. Pricing is also an important part of the big picture, and especially with the issues of supply and demand for parking that I alluded to earlier when we were talking about the costs and revenues for parking. Demand-based pricing, this means that in different parts of the city for different reasons, people are willing to pay more for parking in one area perhaps than in another, depending on the demand for those spaces and the activity in that area. Also in the garages, we want to look at the idea of zone pricing. That is certain areas in the garage dedicated to public transient parking versus other zones dedicated to residential parking, and pricing that works accordingly with those needs. There's also, as I mentioned earlier, hotel zones in Green and Seneca. And the city doesn't have it now, but it is possible to look at zone pricing on the streets in different areas where the parking may be better suited for one reason or another and have more demand for one reason or another, and therefore to create different zones instead of treating it all as one just big massive zone with one price. We already have, for example, residential parking permit zones in College Town. The ring idea that I spoke about earlier would be an example of changing from, say, a 2-hour limit to a long-term, like 8-hour limit, so that could become like a unique zone that could add some capacity that people could use for all-day parking for like the workforce. And then obviously continuing with short-term parking. Short-term parking is paid parking, that is obviously greatly advantageous close into the downtown core where there needs to be high turnover so people can have access to businesses and services and the spaces don't get taken and held all day long. And then another idea is progressive pricing. That is pricing that is low at a lower hourly rate for the first hour of the day or first hour of the parking session or first 2 hours, for example, and it may become more expensive as the session gets longer and longer. That type of pricing would encourage short-term parking where you want short-term parking for high turnover, for access to businesses and so on, and at the same time discourage those spaces from being taken up by all-day parkers. That could be used, for example, in the garages in a zone where you want, especially to promote transit. So, to help us analyze this whole system and all these ideas I've been speaking about, the city is undertaking a comprehensive parking study. We're engaging a consultant who is an expert in parking analysis and parking systems to help evaluate this overall situation. So they're going to analyze the system to begin with, looking at operational and fiscal capabilities of what we have out there right now and how it's working right now. They're going to apply some modeling to project demand in areas of growth in the city. Of particular interest would be the downtown core, College Town, and the waterfront West End area. We want to, of course, look at the future of parking with respect to the Plan Ithaca goals. In the Plan Ithaca goals, there are transportation goals, and those goals promote multimodal transport, the importance of public transit and buses, and also bicycling, walking, and scooters as other modes. So we want to work in concert with that. We want to maximize efficient use of the parking supply. By maximizing what we have, it also reduces the need to have to add structured parking. So we really want to maximize what we have, for that being one of the main reasons. And that's one of the guiding documents that sets out goals, priorities, and strategies for transportation and other areas. Another important area we want to look at is curb space management. There's always competition for curb space, whether it be parking spaces, spaces for buses, bus stops, other forms of public transit such as car share, Uber, Lyft, all those sorts of things. We want to maximize the efficiency and use of the curb space, especially to promote the vision for the downtown area and the Plan Ithaca goals again. We want to use innovative technologies in the garages, on the street, as much as we can. A 10-year period. This implementation plan will also include a fiscal analysis model where we can analyze the fiscal impacts of various strategies that we might want to use into the future. So that list of items there is the focus of this comprehensive parking study, which is scheduled to start soon in September, and will probably take about 10 to 12 months. Here's the estimated timeline for the parking study. We actually did the project scoping in this past spring, finishing in June or so. We were hoping to kick off the project in July. We're looking now at a September start date, and we'll finish probably in September or October of 2020 rather than March of 2020, which was our initial target.